simplified and accelerated the process of customizing video by automating production workflows in various studios, saving them time and resources. Then, as our awesome users asked, we listened. Our latest version of Templator makes it even easier to turn your data into video deliverables. Imagine integrating AE's state-of-the-art capabilities into your own apps. With Templator, it's simple. Leave spreadsheets behind for Templator's integration with Dataclay Q, an API experience that's easy to navigate and empowers you to easily send data from your apps to AE with plug-and-play simplicity. The Q button connects Templator directly to your app's data. Integration is only a click away. Before running an intensive batch render or starting up a rendering server, use Templator's Spot Check feature to export thumbnails of your dynamic comps to easily verify your data renders exactly as you intend and quality assure render jobs in minutes. Templator now also accommodates responsive motion graphics seamlessly, giving users freedom to create dynamic, on-brand motion graphics toolkits. To support multi-frame rendering in After Effects, Templator is now multi-threaded. It also ships with support for Apple's Silicon processor, so you can take full advantage of your system's multi-core processing power and memory for blazing fast performance. This release includes improvements and fixes for long-standing bugs, making it the most robust version ever. Plus, it ships with all the amazing features you've come to enjoy, so you can customize lower thirds, stings, tags, and overlays. Easily replace footage and set auto layout rules. Incorporate live data from various sources, localize text with Google Translate, and perform batch operations that render unique videos or create distinctive compositions. It's ideal for ads, signage, news graphics, interstitials, and so much more. We've also launched a marketplace for our community. New artists can get a head start on using our tool, while existing customers can license their professionally designed, data-ready AE projects to other users. Meet the demand for content with Templator from Dataclay.
Welcome to the Dataclay podcast. I'm Alan Barnwell, and I handle sales and marketing here at Dataclay. But it's time to introduce your host for the podcast, our founder and CEO and chief developer, Ari Stavchansky.
Hey, thanks, Alan. Thanks for that intro. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me again. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to learn a little bit more about our products and how they can suit you. This podcast is really about infrastructure setup when it comes to your studio for putting together a system that automates the production of digital content. And we get a lot of questions regarding licensing, which we're going to get into, and also virtual machine configuration, which we'll touch on as well. So what I'm going to do is show you a overall plan of how things or how studios are typically architected with licensing, and how end users typically go about taking the types of licenses that we offer and activating those licenses on the machines within their environment. So I'm going to start right here, and give me 1 second, make that full screen. So, this is the lowly artist workstation, the alone, the isolated workstation. This is a typical thing that we all have, right? We have our computer and we just want to start getting into the thick of things and creating content. When a user decides that they want to try out Templator, they go to our website, they download the archive of our latest release. And on the left here, what you're seeing is the actual archive expanded. And what I want to point out for this node locked licensing mechanism is that these two down here in blue, the ones that are highlighted down here, are the ones that you would click on to install the node locked build of Templator. And node locked is essentially where you have a manual activation process of your license. On the right side, you'll see, this is just what the installer looks like on Mac OS. When you double click the PKG file, the exe file is used on Windows. So after you download and extract all that content, you install Templator, and you can use it fully featured. But the problem is that it will apply watermarks to all the layers that you make dynamic, and then after 30 days, all features just cease to function on Templator. So essentially, you've got this machine, this workstation that has Templator that is unlicensed after the trial, or even during the trial, really. So what you do when you make that decision that you really want to up your game in terms of dealing with content velocity and creating content very quickly using data with After Effects, you typically go to our website. You will choose the type of edition of Templator that you want, and you'll get a license key. And those license keys can have multiple activations associated with them. And in this case, in this example, this key right here has 2 available activations, meaning that one key can be used or inserted into 2 different machines to activate licenses on 2 different machines. So on the right side here, you're seeing the Templator preferences dialog, the cutout of that, and then also the license management dialog that you get from when clicking this activation button. So it's a very typical process. You take the key, you insert it into the product key field, and then you click activate license. Once you have done that, everything's peachy and your machine is good to go. You've got the license. Now, that key has 1 available activation. And the reason it has 1 is because you've already used one on this one. So if you brought in, let's say, a laptop, you could take that key and activate Templator on that laptop, and you would have no more activations left on that key. So then the question is, well, what happens if you have another machine that you need to run Templator on? For example, you've got a render server or just some kind of server that you have installed AE and you've installed Templator on there. What you can do in this case with node locked is you can manually deactivate the key and then activate the render server. So in this case, what would happen is you would have to figure out the best way in your scenario of deactivating one of the activations from those 2 existing machines to accommodate a license on that 3rd machine. So yes, you essentially wouldn't be able to use all 3 at the same time, but the deactivation process allows you to essentially transfer the license from one machine to another. And these examples here, these screenshots up here are just different ways that you can deactivate. You can deactivate through Templator just by clicking on the deactivate button on the Templator preferences dialog. In which case, when you click that, it'll give you this big warning. And are you sure you want to do it? There's also this list activations button as well, which gives you all of the machines that have an activation associated with the key that the current machine has. And you can deactivate by selecting a row and then clicking on deactivate selected. But in many cases, and this is the most, I'd say, common case where end users get confused is they don't have access to the machine to deactivate any longer. Well, you can go to dataclay.com, go to log in with the same email address that you use to purchase the key, and click log in, and then go to the licenses and billing, and all your keys will be listed here. And if you just click on the blue triangle here, this twirly, you'll see all the activations for that, or for every key that you have. If you click on this, one of these red X's here, the website will ask you, are you sure you want to deactivate? If you deactivate here and you go and you somehow get back to the machine that has the After Effects Templator activation, it won't work anymore. So this is just to show you that there are multiple ways to deactivate a node lock license. Typically, we find that users end up going to the website to do it when they want to transfer a license from one machine to another. And Yeah, so that's deactivation. Once you've deactivated, you can then activate another machine with one of those activations. And so here, what we're seeing is that the original workstation was deactivated, and now Templator is unlicensed, but the server is certainly licensed. So that is effectively node locked licensing, and it is really for the freelancer or a very small studio where you have a limited set of machines, and it's more about getting people access to Templator at the right time when they're sitting in front of the machines that they're operating. That's really what node locked is all about. Now, there are cases where you've got a situation where you have a larger system that needs to be always on, or you have a situation where you have many different machines in a studio. And this is where floating licensing comes into play. So, a lot of Dataclay customers have, several machines, sometimes going up into, tens of machines, like 20, 30 machines. And doing the node locked licensing stuff is just too arduous, it's too time consuming. So what Templator offers is a floating licensing build, and that build gets installed on the machines that need to go off online or offline at will. So here, this is a diagram showing that we've got this floating licensing server, nothing's on it. We've got 4 artist workstations. We've got 2 desktops that are slated to do reversioning. And then we've got 4 render farm virtual machines that are just kind of in the cloud. And so this is kind of a typical setup for a automation system, rather than just having your desktop being capable of producing content automatically. So what happens is to make this a reality, or to activate all the licensing here, what you want to do is you want to install the floating licensing build installer, or rather execute this. And this is, you'll recognize them because there is a folder called floating licensing support. And in that folder, we've got these 2 executables, a PKG and an EXE. One's for Mac, one's for Windows, and the underscore float signifies that this installer is intended for floating licensing. And on here on the right side, I've got a screenshot of the Windows wizard for setup wizard for floating licensing build of Templator, and you can see that part of the setup process requires an entry of the server addresses for where that floating licensing server actually is. So we'll get to the details of that in a little bit. But the other thing to note is that we've got this TurboFloat server folder. And this folder holds just one subfolder called Linux. And inside of this folder is a Linux build of the Templator, what we call TurboFloat server. And it essentially is what holds the pool of licenses and then leases licenses when Templator clients on those machines request a license. So on the bottom right here, you can see this is a Linux terminal with this running this install wizard linux.sh file, and it just guides the user through the installation and activation process for Templator. And I'm going to show you a little bit about that as well. So that is essentially those are the items that you need to look at in the archive and the download when you get into the floating licensing setup. So once you've got the floating licensing software installed on your Linux machine, what happens is the key that you use to activate that license is going to have a set of licenses that it can lease out to clients. And so in this case, what we've done is we've installed Templator on all of the machines in the environment. The floating licensing server has been activated with the key. And typically what happens is inside of the Templator UI, in the preferences area, in the dialog of Templator preferences, you can get to this screen that allows you to specify where the address of where that server exists and which port that templater should use to contact the floating licensing server. So in this case, if I clicked on license server here, this dialog, I can enter an IP with a port. I can enter in a name, or I can enter in a host name, or I can enter in a qualified domain name here. And once you click save, that is saved forever inside of Templater, and it will, when Templater starts back up, when you begin AE, it will automatically in the background request the license. So in this case, what happens is anytime Templater starts up, it queries the floating licensing server using that address information that was entered. And then if there is an available license, those machines effectively get activated. So the end user in front of the machine or the server doesn't have to be concerned with keys and activating and deactivating and all of that kind of stuff. It's all handled in the background, and the floating licensing server knows when a machine goes down. And what happens is when a machine goes down is that the license that it once had is now put back into that pool of licenses to make it available for any other machine that comes onto the scene or gets added to the environment. So this is a really nice way to account for things like peaks of requests that are coming in for Templater to handle. Sometimes you need to have more compute resources, sometimes you don't. So floating licensing really is the answer to those headaches of dealing with how do I get my system up and running and making sure that there's no watermark when a new machine comes up. So if we continue on here, you can see that one of them, one of these machines right here came back up, and just by virtue of it turning on and After Effects starting and Templater loading, the license, the server gets hit up, and the license gets released or leased to Templater. Okay. So one thing to note, though, is that, of course, licensing is related to transacting. We love our customers, and we want to make sure that everything's working and stable. So what happens is that the mechanism that is on the floating licensing server, that licensing mechanism actually is checking what's called a genuineness of the license at regular intervals. So it's checking against our license activation server at Dataclay. So if you are going month to month on a month to month subscription for the floating licensing server software, or for your licenses, you're going to want to have this days between set to something very low. I would recommend 1. And this code is part of what's called a configuration file that ships with the floating licensing server, which I'll show you in a little bit, and what all the config or what the configurations you can do are in this file. I'll show you that in a little bit. So what happens here is, the floating licensing server says, hey, is this genuine? This licensing activation server says, hey, has payment been made? If it has, then yeah, it's all good. All the dates will match up. If the payment hasn't gone through, this is going to say, no, it's not genuine, sorry. And so the floating licensing server will actually go down. So you have to make sure that the floating licensing server is configured correctly in terms of its interval check, and that B, there is a way to transact for the license. Okay, so now we're getting into really mission critical systems. We have a lot of, for example, broadcasters. We have a lot of folks who are doing on-demand systems where people come to web forums and they enter in data and they need video back. So in this case, we recommend having what we call a primary and 2 failover licensing servers. This allows it to. What this means is that if the primary server were to go down, Templater automatically checks for a failover server A and a failover server B. So if the failover server A, if the primary server goes down, it will look at failover server A and then grab licenses from there. So here in this diagram, you can see templators trying to get the licenses from primary, but it's unavailable for whatever reason. So what it does is templator then goes to the address at failover A, and it will successfully get the licenses from that server. When machines go down, the licenses actually get put back onto the server from where it leased the license. It doesn't actually, go back into the primary or something like that. So it keeps track of where the licenses should be. So this is just a really good way to make sure that your templator that's always on and acting as a server is licensed and can get licenses. And then lastly, what I want to talk to you about is in this case is there are instances where customers only need to have a set of machines with a certain edition of templator. Like maybe they need just rig, and then a set of machines that just have templator rig, another set of machines have templator bot, another have templator pro. And in this case, you can do the failover architecture, but where to start is you'll have to have separate floating licensing servers for each edition. So if you have, for example, a cloud-based infrastructure for rendering or reversioning and rendering, you're going to want a floating licensing server for that. But then you've got, let's say, a set of 5 artist machines that need to be utilized by artists. You're going to have a floating licensing server for just the rigs. So just keep that in mind, that you will have to separate floating licensing servers dependent on the type of edition that you want to give to the end user. Okay. So that's kind of the overview of the licensing architecture, the difference between node locked and floating and what they do. And so what I want to show you, though, is the process by which one would go through to set up a server. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is bring this up. Whoops. And this is a local virtual machine. It's a Linux box that's running on my current Mac. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is log in. And what we're going to see here is a terminal. And then I've got the folder from the archive of the download here. So if I were to, just do a list here, for example, let me kind of make it a little bit bigger. What you're seeing here is the same thing as here, right? So if I go into the floating licensing server, licensing support folder and list that, here are the installers, and then there's this other folder called Turbo Float Server. So, oops, let me go back here. If I were to double click this, now I'm in that folder. And then what we really want to do is get into this Linux area here. So I'm going to go into the Turbo Float Server folder, subfolder. And I'm going to go into the Linux folder. And you're going to see this install wizard linux.sh file. Now, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to run this as sudo. So basically super user does. So you would type in sudo install, /install wizard, because we're in that directory. And what happens is, you'll enter in your password, and you'll get this kind of header, and it's going to ask for the product key that you want to use for activating the floating licensing server. And so I have a key here. This is a throwaway key, so I don't mind if anybody takes the key. We're just going to get rid of it after the demo. I'm going to paste it into here, and we're going to, we hit enter, and it asks for, what am I doing here? It asks for the port that we want to bind the floating licensing server to, which is critical. And if you don't enter anything in here, it's just going to choose 13, but I'm going to enter in 13. And then here it's saying how long should a license be leased by a templater client before it renews with the server, meaning this is a regular interval that the client hits up the server and says, hey, I'm still alive. So I'm going to need to renew the license. If the machine is gone, the server is like, hey, where are you? I can't find you. So I'm going to make the license available to the next machine that requests it. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to enter in 31 here because there's a little bug here where if you put 30, it just keeps asking you. So I'm going to put 31 seconds. And then it says, where do you want the server to log all the information to, all of what it does? And by default, we put it in where the Linux operating system usually puts logs, which is in var log, and we call it dataclay-tfs.log. So I'm just going to hit enter. And then where do we want to install it? You can choose wherever you want to install the licensing server software. I'm going to do the /opt, which is typically where third-party software gets installed on Linux. And then it's just telling you, hey, this is where it's going to get installed into /opt/Dataclay. So we're going to hit yes. And then the interesting thing about the floating licensing server for Linux is that Linux comes in many flavors. There's many different processors that are capable of running Linux. In this case, this is a VM that is running on a Mac M1, so it's an ARM or Silicon. So I'm going to hit 3, and it tells you a bunch of stuff here. And I think we might have an error, but it looks like all is good. So it looks like, it tells you, we hit 3 here. It copies all the files to the opt Dataclay folder. It attempts to set up the config file, which I'll get into next. It shows you what the key is, and then it tells you some helpful commands that you can run. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, though, is I'm going to show you this configuration file before we actually start the server. So the configuration file is found in the opt Dataclay folder, and it's called turbofloat server config.xml. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is do sudo vim opt Dataclay turbofloat server config.xml. And basically sudo vim is a text editor for Linux. Sudo means that I'm going to edit it with administrative privileges. So we hit enter. And let me go ahead and make this a little bit smaller so we can kind of see it in a little bit more. Okay. So basically what's going on here is when we open up the file, it's a very simple file, but it's documented pretty well with these comments here. So here is where, the port that the wizard was asking us earlier, we can change that from 13 to something else. The threads, I recommend leaving it at 0. This just is more efficient in terms of how many worker threads the floating licensing server is going to use. So, if you have 1,000 machines, the server is able to respond to those machines very easily. This is the length of time in seconds for how long, the license should be leased for. We entered 31. And then here is an important one, which we're going to change. This is for the log. And really what I suggest personally in terms of good troubleshooting is we want to change it from warning to notification. So for level, we're going to change it to notification, which means that it's going to log literally everything. It pretty much logs all of what's going on in the server, which is something that I think is extremely useful. If you just do warning and error, your log file is going to be lighter, but you won't get as much information. Okay, so we continue down the path, and what we've got here now is the grace period, or rather the days between genuine checks. And so for this, I'm just going to change it from 90 to 1. And the reason we have it from 90 is, or the reason that it's defaulted to 90 is that, typically when customers are buying the floating licensing, they're doing long term, so they want a lot of savings in terms of the economics, and they'll buy like a year-long license. And so, it doesn't make sense for the floating licensing server to constantly be hitting up the genuine activation server. And so we're just going to reduce it so that if you buy a month to month, you're guaranteed that every day it's going to check the genuineness of it. And then down below here is related to the proxy, like a proxy, which is typically not needed. But if you need further information on that, we're happy to provide that. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm going to write the file. So I hit :W for write. And then I'm going to quit Vim. And so now the configuration is all set up. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and start the server using this line right here. So TurboFloat server is the actual binary that needs to be launched for the server to work. -X means that it's going to just launch it not as a daemon process like in the background. It's going to launch it as long as the terminal that I've got open is alive and open. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just type in literally what it says there. TurboFloat server -X. And you're going to see a message here that says, okay, we've got a notification. And this is all getting logged, by the way. And it's creating a pool of, a thread. It's going to utilize all the cores in this VM. And it's, started this thing and it's ready to go. And this is the version of the TurboFloat server. Okay. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just kind of move this over here. Let's just make it kind of a little bit smaller. And we're going to actually bring this over to the side as well. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is now bring up After Effects. And when you install the floating licensing build in After Effects, the preferences area of After Effects is different from the node locked version. So in the Mac world, in Mac OS, if I go to preferences here, this is the floating licensing build. I can know that I've got that floating licensing build if I click on the About dialog, and I see at the bottom, I can see the version name and I can see the word float here. So that means that this is the floating build for Templator. And if I click on this license server here, I can enter in an address. And for this demo, I have this domain or subdomain at our main domain called lickdemo.dataclay.com. So you enter in the address. It could be an IP address. You're going to have to know the port. You click save. And then Templator is saying, okay, I'm going to save this for moving forward. So if I quit AE, if I shut down the machine, it's going to remember it. Okay. So if I click on, and I'm going to kind of zoom up here a little bit. If I click on the request license, what's going to happen is it's going to hit up this server, and we should see that it gets a license. So if I hit request, it says Templator licensing information. The machine retrieved the license and it got it from here. So that's that. And so I'm going to click OK. And if I go over here and kind of zoom up here, we can see that the floating licensing server is showing us that it's got a new connection. This key in particular has 3 activations available to it, meaning the floating licensing server is going to manage 3 licenses, and that it's one is used and there's 3 total. And you can see that because we set it up to 31 seconds, every 31st second, it's going to kind of emit this notification that it's renewing the license to that particular client. Okay, so this machine now is totally ready to be used in terms of, whatever edition this is. I believe this is bought because all of the functions are here. So if I go into preferences and I go to license info, it tells me, okay, this machine has a license from this address and all the features from all the editions are available here. Okay, So if I wanted to get rid of the license and say another artist is in my studio and they want to use Templator, I can go into here if I'm in front of the machine and click drop license. And if we click drop, it tells me, okay, we dropped the license. This is not licensed any longer. If I go here and take a look, you can see the lease was released by the client. And now I've got 3 licenses available out of, there's 3 and there's none are being used. So that is effectively how you interact in terms of, working with Templator and the floating licensing server manually. You can do the request and drop. Now, I'm going to request it again. And you can see we've now got back up to 1 out of 3. And I'm not going to do any dropping, but I want you to see what happens when I quit After Effects. I'm going to go to After Effects and quit. And if we look at this for a little while, after the period of time of renewal, what you're going to see is that it will have dropped by itself. So let's take a look. Let's wait a little bit, and it should say that so it's expired. It did not renew, and now there are 3 total, and there's none being used. Okay, so just by virtue of After Effects quitting, that signals to the floating licensing server that, hey, Templator is no longer in use. The license can be, that activation of the license can be used elsewhere on another machine. So let's go ahead and I'm going to start up After Effects again. And we're going to see that without doing anything, no request license, none of that, just Templator starting up. We're going to take a look and we can already see that it's got a license here. It actually shows that it's being used. So that is effectively the kind of that's the convenience of having floating licensing. Now, what I'm going to do now is go over to a virtual machine, and I'm going to show you how you can point that virtual machine to the same server to get another license while this one has it as well. So this is a virtual machine that's in AWS. It is running Windows Server 2019. Now, Adobe unfortunately does not, by default, support After Effects running on Windows Server, but we at Dataclay do our fair share of testing, and we can, definitely say that it does work just fine. You can see it has 16 gigabytes of memory, which is part of the system requirements. Typically you want something even stronger than this on a VM. And what we're going to do is install. We're going to install the floating licensing build. So we're going to go ahead and extract all of this. Open up the folder. We are going to go into the floating licensing support here. Click that. We are going to start up the float.exe one right here. Double click that. Okay, and we start to get this wizard, and you can see that this float term is here in the wizard title. So we're going to click next. The first thing it wants to know before proceeding, it won't even let me proceed, is where is the licensing server? So, the way that we built this is such that we would expect the end user to have the licensing server stood up and set up prior to installing this. So in this case, I'm going to do lickdemo.dataclay.com and :13. Okay, so I'm going to hit next. And by the way, if I had the failover servers, I'd want to enter them here too. So I'm going to click next, agree, next, and install. So now Templator floating licensing build is being installed. Okay, it's done. And what we're going to do is go ahead and start up After Effects. And what we should see over here on our VM of the Linux VM running floating licensing server is that not only will it say that it's got 1 out of 3 machines, it's now going to say 2 out of 3. So let's go ahead and start AE. All right. Okay. Here we're going to go up to Window, and we're going to bring up Templator 3. and it looks like things are working. If I go into preferences, because I installed it on Windows, it already should know the licensing server. There it is. There's my port. And if I go back to here, there it is. It's showing that we have 2 total out of 3 available. Okay. So now I don't have to worry about, any worries about, do I have access to the machine? The VM might go down, and, you know, the floating licensing server is going to take care of it. So really the trick is you have to make sure that this floating licensing server doesn't go down. That's a DevOps thing, but that's really, how this stuff works. So if I go here and, for example, I say drop the lease, it's going to tell me that it did drop the lease from the licensing server. So I click OK. I go back here, and then we can see now, instead of 2 out of 3, we've got 1 activation out of 3 right here. So you can see it was released manually. I can go back and request the license, and here we go. It's saying it retrieved it. I can go back and check it out on the server, and yes, there it is right there. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is, instead of dropping it, I'm just going to go ahead and quit After Effects on the VM, go back here and kind of wait a little bit until the floating licensing server recognizes that it's all gone. So let's take a look. All right. Okay. It's expired. And now we're back from 1 to 3, 1 out of 3 here. So again, I can show you a different machine and max them all out. If you end up with 3 out of 3, and then you have a 4th machine, Templator is going to tell you, hey, sorry, all the licenses are being used. You're going to have to ask somebody to quit, or buy more licenses. If you do add more licenses to the floating licensing key, then you have to go and restart the server in the floating licensing server box. So to do that, typically what we have are people who are typically, we get inquiries about how do you restart the floating licensing server. Because I started the server with the -X all the way back up here, I use this. That means that if I were to shut this down, that basically turns the server off. So, that's, that you would have to do that. But I'm going to go ahead and just do Control-C. So now the server is not available. If I were to go to the preferences and, try to request, this is saying it already has one, but let's say I want to drop it. It's going to tell you, hey, there's an issue dropping the license. It can't get it back to the pool. So, tough. And so, you got to figure out what you got to get your admin to launch the server again. But let's say I want to add more licenses. What I would have to do is figure out, how to reactivate without going through the installer. Now, I could just run the installer again using the sudo install wizard and re-enter the product key. I could do that. The problem with this is that it might overwrite configurations that you have on the XML. So what you can do is you can just go to the location where the file is and just run TurboFloat server and just check out what available options there are. Sorry, it needs to have the -H. So these are all the flags that you can give the TurboFloat server command. Some of them are for Windows and Mac versions of the floating licensing server, and some of them are for Linux. I will say that we only ship the Linux build of the floating licensing server with our archive because we want to encourage our users to use Linux as the floating licensing server. Yes, you can use Windows and you can use Mac. Just contact our support. We're happy to get you the correct build for your OS. But really, it's more economical to use Linux. It's more stable to use Linux, and it just provides the most flexibility, even though it does take a little bit more, dev chops to stand it up. So just keep that in mind. That feel free to reach out. We will provide a Windows floating licensing server and a Mac floating licensing server software if you need that or want that. You might have an old Mac that you want to relegate to a server and that kind of thing. So we can definitely provide that to you. Here there is the where is it? The A that basically activates a server with the product key. So if you add more activations to the key, we will add it to the key on our license on our activation server, and then you'll have to do the -A, and then that will effectively it'll reactivate it. So if I do that, it's now activated. So you would just have to get in touch with us. We can add new activations and so on and so forth. So once it's activated, then I can start it again. And so now it's ready to go. And this should be able to either drop or release. Let's see, our request. Yeah, and so it got it. And so now it's good to go again. So, that's floating licensing, in terms of the nitty gritty. Now what I want to show you is a little bit about the Windows machine here. So I showed you the, what kind of machine it is, but I do have, I do want to show you a little bit about what's going on the AWS side when you want to start a VM for After Effects and for Templator. Basically, you're going to go to your EC2 in one of the availability zones that is closest to you. You're going to want to give the server a name. I'm not going to go through and actually launch the instance, but I'm just going to kind of go through the configuration. You give the server a name, and you're going to want to choose Windows. Like, you can choose Mac. It's more involved. It's more expensive because Mac OS VMs require a dedicated server, which is more expensive on the Amazon side. So we do recommend using Windows Server as the place to start. You're going to want to choose the latest Windows Server, and you're going to want to use base. Stay away from the core base, because core is really Windows Server without a GUI. That's not going to take our type of users very far. So we're going to, because After Effects does need some kind of GUI, choose the base right there. You're going to, make sure that it's got the 64-bit, which is now standard. And then you get to the instance type. And I think this is the biggest question that our end users have is, what should the type be if we're going to use AWS? And this, goes for other services as well, Azure or GCP, Google Cloud Platform. Basically, After Effects works best when you've got a machine or a VM that's optimized for RAM. And so in the AWS world, in the Amazon world, the R5 line is really great for that. So, at the very least, you're going to want to have 16 gigabytes of memory. But typically for VMs, I would even increase it to maybe 32. And then if you've really got those heavy effects on your templates, you're going to want to up the ante to even higher amounts of RAM. So for this one, I'm just gonna go ahead and choose the 16 gigabyte, and then you're going to have to create a new key pair, which allows you to use Microsoft Remote Desktop, which enables you to do things like this, where you can, literally use the machine. Like, I'm on a Mac right now, but you can remote into the Windows machine and use it as if you were there. So this key pair is used inside or in the Remote Desktop application, and you'll have to save the file, and it'll generate a administrator password and so on and so forth. And then you're going to want to make sure that that there's security, that there's like a firewall. You want to make sure that nobody can necessarily access it that shouldn't be accessing it. So you do the security stuff here, and then you get to the storage. And the storage really should be something that you might have on a workstation that's sitting in front of you physically. Typically, maybe 500 gigabytes is good. You've got that will cover Windows, it'll cover AE, and then it'll cover the all the output that that templater might be rendering. So just keep that in mind. So then when you launch the instance, you essentially log in and you install the Creative Cloud application. And then you go through the process of installing the versions of After Effects that you need on the server. Now, one of the big questions is, well, Templator has this floating licensing mechanism, but Adobe doesn't. And, of course, Adobe certainly wants to also keep its licensing in check. And so, you have to bring your own email and password or identity to the Creative Cloud application to activate the After Effects application. Now, if you terminate the VM and you restart it, you spin it back up after taking a snapshot, you're going to have to log back in to Creative Cloud again, because the Creative Cloud is intelligent enough to know, or it interprets a restarted machine as a new machine. So, you have to keep that in mind when you're building your architecture. And so, yeah, I mean, that's effectively, what it takes to get a VM working with Templator and After Effects together. I think that, a lot of the technicalities of the floating licensing server, it's really meant for systems-based stuff. But again, if you are a freelancer or you're a small studio, the node locked licensing is going to be just fine. And so I think with that, I'm gonna wrap it up. I want to, if there's any questions out there, Alan, I don't know if anything came in, but I'm happy to answer any questions that came through.
There have been a couple of comments, but nothing that's a big question.
Okay.
I do think that I wanted to make a couple of quick observations that come from more of the cost side of things.
Sure.
We have some customers that are doing a lot of renderings pretty much throughout the year, and they purchase a significant number of bots that are annual licenses, and then they have seasons where they have some heavy loads that come up and but from our experience, and I wanted to share this just for folks who are trying to get an idea about how they might grow their business and what the costs might look like. The virtual machines, if you're using them all year long, that gets terribly expensive.
Yeah.
And so we find that customers who have the work to support it do much better making investments in the hardware and having the machines. And just to share kind of what that looks like, anywhere between, we have a customer that has between 8 and 16 physical systems, and they're able to accommodate a production of 100,000 short minute 30 videos
Yeah.
in length per week. So 100, that's the kind of uh, uh, throughput you can achieve with template or setups, and just to help people get an idea about the volume that they might need. And so you can imagine if you had to suddenly get several 100,000 videos out, and they're just 30-second videos. In that scenario, if it's just a peak, you would want to uh, most likely you do that with virtual machines, and
Absolutely.
and that
Yeah.
kind of gives you an idea about how many virtual machines you might need.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing to note is that, like, once a customer gets to past a threshold, and they need a huge amount of machines, in some cases we'll do a daily bot license, so that they can, save on the economies of scale, really. So it's really we will reserve that for the customers who are really pushing it hard. Um, so yes, definitely, you know, a lot of the larger enterprises that have these systems in place, these always on systems, they're going to have peaks that are, requests that ebb and flow depending on the time of year. And so the floating licensing really helps them have a headache-free, way to make sure everything's licensed and ready to run.
Right, and
So
let me make another observation about one of our customers. They have a number of physical machines which they keep node lock license on permanently,
yeah,
and then but they also keep a floating license server which they only purchase activations for that license server during a peak month, and so they'll go from just having the single activation of the floating server to maybe having 30 uh, or more activations on that floating server for a single month. So when you have a subscription, any of your pro or bot subscriptions, if you know you're going to hit a peak month, you can always contact us and we can always sell you that month a number of activations, and then you only pay for them for that month, and then you can
sure.
reduce back to your standard subscription activation total.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so that's about it. If there's no questions, then I'm going to cut it off there. This was I know, intensely detailed uh, podcast, but I appreciate everybody who came to watch and to understand a little bit more about it. And of course, this video, this broadcast can be referenced at any time. So, yeah, I think, thanks for joining, everybody. I appreciate it.